Hey y'all. Sorry to interrupt your regularly scheduled upload, but I wanted to give a quick message. As you can see in the description of the video, this installment is just one part of 15. So to make sure that I don't bog down the channel with only one story at a time, I'll be putting these up every other upload or so. Or, well, maybe even every 2 uploads, depending on how well it's received. I'm also doing it because Underhill's a psychological thriller, with some dark fantasy elements. So the series will necessarily have a slow-building plot, which I know isn't everyone's cup of tea, nor their jam. And given that the whole point of this channel is to give people stories that they might enjoy, the last thing that I want to do is steer people off just because I like the story. Right. Well, that's it. So for those who are still here and ready to listen to the story, I'll shut up and let it speak for itself. I hope y'all enjoy. Underhill, Part 1. An original short story by Charlie C.C. Thomas. Tuesday, April 7th. Sarah Bowen breathed deep against her husband's chest, eyes shut and thought drifting from wakeful shores as Joseph Bowen's warmth wrapped her like the blanket over them both. The light of the moon was forgotten from outside their window. The smell of Joseph's body dwindled as her consciousness paddled away from the lit shores of reality and into the nightish seas of dream. She stood in the dark and the cold and silence as shadows swam into color and shape. A cathedral of gray and brown stone rose before her, Gothic spires jutting into the endless black. Cold and damp soaked into her bare feet from the stone dais beneath. Winter's breath drifting off the rails either side the river of stairs behind, and icy cold rolled down from the gargantuan double doors before her. They stood black as pitch, yet glinting, weeping, in the pale light from the stained glass windows, filling the misty blackness with bleached color. She stepped forward and the doors shuddered, groaning like displeased giants until they were open just enough for her to stand beneath the yawning maw of the cathedral. Pale light blossomed from green flame in brazen sconces bolted to the stone, and candelabras fixed to the rows of columns amid the hall, supporting the vaulted ceiling. What should have been gray stone, the ceilings, walls, and floor, became rotten white in the sickly flames closest the doors, bleaching paler and paler the deeper she looked into the room, until everything was awash in sterile marble at the column's end. She blinked and stepped inside with the uncaring curiosity of a dreamer, breathing deeply and bristling as freshly churned earth hung heavy in the air. But her head was fixed up at the wall opposite the double doors, eyes drinking in the vibrant colors of the circular stained-glass window, its figures unfamiliar and alien. But aside from the columns and brazen fixtures, the only thing in the massive hall was a stage beneath the circular window, black as the doors and shimmering in the light like they'd just been mopped. She turned around, brows furrowing as she drank in everything, stopping as the doors silently shut and locked out the darkness. She swallowed and finished her turn, everything so familiar and so alien. There should be seats, she thought. No. Pews. There should be pews, and tables on the walls, tapestries, statues, a fresco on the ceiling. But more than that. Everywhere her eyes glided was the shadow of memory, like the light spot on a wall behind a vanished painting. There should have been color, basins by the door, seats on the stage. There should have been an effigy hung beneath the stained-glass window. And the windows. There should be more windows. Instead, it sat empty and watchful and silent. She followed the path between the columns down the center of the long hall, fading from sickly green to stark white, until she stood before the stage. The figures of the window were clearer now. A woman and man in bright colors with things busying about her skirts. She swallowed, blinked. Then the window was gone. She was on her back, looking at the bare ceiling. She tried to sit up and stopped when she saw her naked stomach, swollen and moving. She set her hand on it and something slid under the skin. A tiny hand beneath her own. She froze, wide-eyed with all the fear of the waking world stabbing through the safety of dream. Burning cold flew in on the backs of distant high giggles behind her. She turned to look, the air full of feet sliding on stone, but gasped at the hot, wet gush soaking her thighs. She spun back around, staring at the mucus soaking into the black grain, and panted, heart thrumming in her chest as she shook her head. "No, no, 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 no," she said, scooting back like she could escape it. She opened her mouth again, but her throat closed, body becoming a taut, burning wire curling around her stomach. The tension died. She crashed back to her elbows with a deep gasp, panting as she spread her legs and groaned at the building tension. It broke. She clawed at the blackwood stage. Teeth bore and eyes slammed shut as she pushed, fire sparking to life inside. She vomited her breath when it stopped and slumped against the floor, a high whimper flying from her lips. She swallowed and groaned as she pushed herself up in a better position. Her body clenched, throwing her back to the stage with a scream as the baby moved. She gasped as the tension fell, the baby sliding into the birth canal. Tears fell as she rolled her head side to side, whimpering as it tried to move inside. She opened her mouth to cry and screamed instead, bearing down and pushing the baby closer to the world. She pushed, she stretched, she screamed. It was a primal thing, clawing from her guts, tearing past her mouth to slash the air. She pushed, body burning and tearing, cold fire opening her pelvis until it threatened to snap. The contraction stopped. She gasped and let the air be silent for just a moment, just long enough to hear the distant giggles and laughs, high and sweet as bells as they stabbed her ears. She fell to her back, panting as tears fell, mouth open like it was held by wire. She bore her teeth and rolled to one side, pushing onto her hands and knees as another contraction racked her. White fire burst between her legs as her sore throat opened on another long scream, silencing the high, sweet voices. Her fingers and toes twisted as she gasped for another breath, chest tight for want of air and the long push. She cried, sweat dripping from her skin in silent splats as it stopped. She panted and growled, shaking her head. It was almost out, almost free. She set her hand between her legs, took a deep, shaky breath, and shouted with a push. After a ring of burning coals passed through her flesh, the head fell into her hand. She panted, she screamed, she pushed, almost consumed by the gnawing white flames, until the shoulders came free and her baby fell. She groaned and panted, half expecting it to slap onto the floor, but there was no smack, nor scream. She looked down between her legs and found a pair of pale hands, long fingernails curling like thorns around her child. She groaned and panted as she fell to one hip and spun around, legs still open with the cord hung between her and the baby. She swallowed on a sore throat, finding the stranger's face, a slim, sharp thing with skin white as the stone. His white gold hair was pulled back loosely over his bright red robe with gold hem. She breathed deeply, brows furrowing even as the cold, numb relief washed over her. The stranger smiled, his sharp, angular features twisting, angelically beautiful and terrifying, but then he held up her baby for her to see, his crystal blue eyes never leaving it. She looked at her son as he turned his head about and squirmed, scrunching up his little face. She looked past the mucus, the blood and pain, and found her boy beneath. All it took to make him what he is, what he could become. She smiled, new tears, sweet tears, falling as she laughed at the ridiculousness of it all, and reached for him. She set her fingers in his tiny hand, and her heart swelled, joy replacing the pain until it was forgotten, and she reached to take him. The man pulled him away, smiling down at her baby and setting him against his chest. She furrowed her brows and caught herself so she wouldn't fall, staring at the stranger. His pale skin almost became translucent in the white flames, his hair near blue, his eyes almost aglow. "What are you doing?" Sarah panted, licking her lips as she waited for an answer, but the pale man never looked at her, just her son. "Give him to me. Give me my son." She pushed herself up with a wince, trying to reach for him again, but stopped as a woman knelt beside her. Her blue and green dress like silk, dark and bleeding against her pale skin and hair. She smiled wide, teeth too perfect, white and narrow, and showed Sarah the babe in her arms, rocking it. It was still wet from birth, a cowl over its head and eyes. The woman turned and set the other baby against Sarah's chest, letting go so Sarah had to rush her arms up. She flicked between the woman and the baby, between the man and her son. She swallowed and looked back to the woman, her pale, slender hand finding Sarah's naked shoulder, cool and dry against her sweaty skin, with nails long as the man's. The woman smiled and gestured to her child. Sarah looked again between the babe in her arms and the woman, settling on the one beneath her and its cowl. She swallowed and carefully picked up the thin flesh, pulling it free until she could make out an eye. It fluttered open, and she stared. The iris was the moon, full of streaks and craters and valleys. When the baby blinked up at her, the white of the cathedral became black, became darkness, became the night. She blinked and squinted her eyes through the bedroom window, sitting up and looking around until she remembered where she was. She found her navel and sighed, patting her flat stomach before she sat up and faced the window as the last of the stars twinkled out, chuckling to herself. She looked behind her to the empty side of the bed and slid over it, sighing at the lack of warmth, but smiling at the faint hint of Joseph's smell. She sat up and groaned at the start of the day, crawling out of bed and stretching before taking the hall to the stairs and finding her way to the kitchen. She went to the coffee maker next to the sink and started a fresh pot, humming at the smell of the cooking grounds as she leaned on the counter and looked through the window over the sink. She smiled at her garden and went for the back door, stepping into the cool, damp air as the sun broke the horizon and filled the sky with fire and pastel clouds. She stood before the lawn table and chairs on their back porch, looking at the fruits of her labor, greens, beans, and tubers, and smiled around a yawn. "Joseph didn't even want a garden when we first got this place," she thought with a chuckle. "Oh, how the tides have changed." She added aloud, "If it wasn't for your promotion, Mr. Bowen, I think you'd spend as much time in the dirt as me." She stepped back inside to make a cup of coffee and returned to her spot, sitting at the table and stretching as she watched the last of the stars glimmer away. Then she stood, mug in hand, and took the 3 concrete steps to the garden. Raised beds met her as she felt the leaves and picked at the dying stalks. She checked the soil as she sipped her coffee and pulled the water hose from the wall, letting a fine spray blanket the leaves before coiling it back up around her shoulder and elbow. She stopped near the wall, furrowing her brow at tiny mushroom heads a few feet away from the house. She hung up the hose with a sigh and followed the mushroom patch, finding them in splotches parallel the back of the home. She finished her coffee and went to the shed on the back edge of the property, where the trees grew wild over the lawn, pulling out her spade and bucket, and dropping, hand and knee, before the invaders. Mushrooms and dirt came up in piles easily thanks to the good soil. But that means this might not do it. Regardless, she threw the fungus into the pail and worked her way from one corner to the steps, shivering in the morning breeze. She stopped and stretched her back, watching the trees sway and the unseen songbirds fill the morning with sweetness. She sighed deeply and picked up her spade. Uprooting the unwanted guest as something else droned on the wind, deeper and sourer than the other songs. It croaked and choked itself as she sat back on the mushrooms, screaming bloody murder again and again. She looked through the trees, thinking, maybe it's caught in something. But there was nothing. So she kept on, and so did the calls. It screamed in the trees, droning in the branches as it flapped its wings, flitting between the boughs behind their house like an unseen shadow. She ignored it, shoveling the last patch of mushrooms into the pail and brushing her knees as she stood. The squawks stopped. She looked into the trees, brighter from the sun, easier to spot the bird from shadow. But nothing moved. If it was there, she'd never see it. She rubbed her hands together, dirt falling from her prints before she carried the bucket to the side of the house and upturned it into a large gray composter. She shut the lid and stopped, setting the bucket aside to squat next to it. A brown fox lay there, eyes dim and open, chest still, face frozen with its mouth hanging and lips peeled back in a cough or grimace. Its fur was matted and dull, and ants had only just started to work on the body. She sighed and smiled sadly at it. Sorry, little guy. Sorry I didn't find you sooner. She stood, and another squawk came from the trees as she made her way back to the shed for a shovel, looking up as a blackbird hopped from one branch to another. It turned its head sideways and cawed at her, ruffling its wings before standing upright and calling to the sky. Thanks for the music this morning, she said sarcastically, going back to the dead fox. It was really soothing, gave me plenty of good vibes. She slid the shovel under the poor creature. Still limp, this guy must have just died, and hoisted him up. His head and limbs swayed with each step, nearly sliding off before she made it to the tree line furthest from the garden. She laid the body aside and sunk the shovel into the earth, building a mound opposite the fox as the blackbird called out 3 times. Its wings sung as it navigated the branches, flapping as it landed near the garden. She stood upright beside the half-dug hole and stared at the bird, a crow, panting. Don't you dare, or I'll hit you with this shovel. The crow hopped and turned, setting its head on its side to look at her. You heard me. Away from my garden. She stepped forward, waving her arms. It flapped its wings and cawed angrily at her, landing by the trees and pecking at sticks. She returned to the hole, looking at the crow every few swings, but it stayed. It pecked at the ground, hopping, flitting from her and the fox to the squirrels and birds. It kept clear of the garden, kept clear of the trees, slowly creeping closer to her when her eyes weren't on it. She stopped and sighed, craning her neck to the side to stare at it like she might an annoying child. It croaked. It was slow and deep, practically a growl, and came with raised feathers. I know cats that could take lessons from you, she said before flashing a faux smile that fell faster than a stone. She turned and went back to her work, humming amid pants and grunts as she hefted the dirt onto the growing mound. Nearly done, she stabbed the earth with the shovel and stood upright, stretching her back as the crow hopped at the edge of her vision. She turned and found it pecking at the fox's eye, tearing its lid to get to the jelly and chirping to itself. She shooed it with her hands and sighed, shaking her head after it flew away a few feet. She reached for the shovel to finish, but it hopped back to the fox's face, and again, until finally Sarah took the shovel and shoved it toward the crow. It never would have hit it, but the bird squawked and screeched all the same, taking wing and disappearing in the branches to scream at her. She finished the hole to its songs from above as it hopped from one branch to another, louder in some places than others, always trying to draw her eye. She ignored it as best she could until the hole was deep enough, and picked up the fox, setting it to the bottom. She leaned on her shovel and sighed, looking at its grimacing face. Sorry, buddy, but maybe that's what you get for yipping all night for the past week. She shoveled the mound of dirt into the hole and covered the fox, still serenaded by the crow, until she had to drag the blade over the grass and stomp the soil to level the ground. She wiped the sweat from her forehead, sighing at the dirt and grime now covering her pajama shorts and tank top, and made her way to the shed, tapping the shovel clean on the corner before putting it away. She turned, and the crow stood on the patch of dirt, looking at her and squawking. It pecked the ground, tilting its head and hopping to face her with one final caw. "I'm not leaving out a corpse just so you can eat. Go find a stray cat or something." It screamed and flew at her. She recoiled and threw her arms up to shield her face. It pecked at her forearms, claws digging into the skin as she turned and backed away. She sprinted through her garden, but the crow followed, shouting at her and pecking the back of her head. She hissed in pain and spun, slinging out her arm as the crow flew up and circled back to attack again. Her open hand caught it in the side and sent it spinning through the air to land on the other side of her raised grow bed. She panted, ready for it to launch at her again, but it didn't come. She walked around the bed, fists balled as she eyed the twitching bird. The tension building in her every fiber went out with a single sigh. The crow kicked up its leg and she jumped back. Its wings were flat on the ground, toes twitching as it pushed itself, rolling to its feet and shaking itself clean. The feathers ruffled and settled as it cawed weakly. Then its wings opened and it bolted for the sky, leaving Sarah alone to watch it escape into the pale, gray clouds before she cleaned her wounds. Tuesday, April 14th. Sarah stood within the gray stone church, pale flames casting sickly shadows and turning the walls a dirty, mossy green. She stared at the stained glass window over the stage, somehow already knowing the massive double doors behind her were shut and would let her leave as easily as an angry jailer. She stepped forward, eyes tracing the golden rods between the bristling shards of glass, deciphering the muddle of strange shapes and figures as they stared back at her. There was a man in red robes with silver hair standing under the right hand of a beautiful woman, her skin silver, her hair golden, her gown flowing like a torrential river of sapphires. Her hands were outstretched, holding a cocoon of swaddling cloth. Her left hand cradled the unseen head whilst the babe's arm reached up, pink and lively. And beneath them all, swimming in the folds of the lady's gown, were a dozen children and more, pale skin, light-haired with silver, blonde, and white. And all looked on as though they could see the empty hall and Sarah within it. All their bright eyes fell on her, as hers fell on the baby. The dead, deafening silence snapped with a bleating cry. Sarah jumped and turned to the tall archway left of the stage on the back wall. Then the cry came again from the hall on the right, and again from both. It whined and cried and sobbed, and Sarah's chest twisted with barbed wire. She swallowed and darted down the hall on the right, plunging into the darkness so thick it swallowed her, leaving the window to look at the nothing that it ruled. The cries came again, the light of the hall digging deep at her back, casting long, strange shadows as the walls grew rougher with each stride. She panted as the cries climbed, louder, deeper, ripping out of the babe. It needed help. It needed her. She bounded, turning right at a fork and wincing at the pale light of the flaming sconce. She leaned back as the floor slanted, leading her deeper into the cool earth, the air chill enough to bristle her skin and sting her lungs. The sconces flickered and their shadows danced with them, light crashing over mounded walls that might cut if she touched them, over loose stones and fixed, rounded rock. She stopped at a fork and looked between them. The cries leapt from the tunnel on the left, but before she chased after it, her eyes fell on the wall, blinking against the nearby sconce. She froze and swallowed, hand trembling over the mounded, decorated tunnel surface and daring to brush it. Not rocks, she thought. 2 rows of skulls lined the walls either side with standing arm or leg bones above and below, Ribs arched over the top of the standing bones as little fingers jutted from the corner of the wall and floor. She stepped back and looked up at the fully assembled spines branching out from the center of the ceiling. Pelvises splayed open between the tailbones and ribs. She swallowed and looked back the way she came. I could make it back, she thought. Just a few lefts and rights. She faced away from the fork, and the baby howled in pain. She could see it behind her eyes, torn open and rent in pieces. Her heart ached and her guts slithered into knots, pressing up into her chest to push her deeper. She looked back into the hungry darkness, down the left tunnel, and back the way that she came. A man stood at the end, his silhouette gray against the pale backlight of the sconces. His arms were crossed behind him, his hair long, still as stone, his legs apart like a guard on watch. She went to take a step forward, and the baby's shriek exploded behind her. She jumped forward and spun to look into the blackness, opening her eyes on the bedroom ceiling. She stared at the smooth surface above as something cold wormed around her chest, coiling around her stomach, tighter and tighter and tighter still. She swallowed, ignoring the pounding under her ribs, her temples, her ears, and found the small shadows in the ceiling left by tiny imperfections standing against the faint moonlight. She set her hands on her stomach, one atop the other to keep them from picking at the bed or her nails, and counted the shadows, ignoring the echoes of bone and distant screams. She shut her eyes as her heart throbbed in her ears. Breathing deep, her fingers spread out over her stomach and dug into the skin beneath the blanket. She gritted her teeth against the echoing screams of the baby, her baby, and the images of its body torn and shredded. She reached instinctively for Joseph, but his side was empty. A quick glance at the clock made her heart sink. He'd left for work hours ago. She rolled onto her side and grabbed his pillow, curling around it as she focused on her breath, in through her nose, out through her mouth. She wanted to shut her eyes, to squeeze them so tight the images couldn't get through, but she forced them open, and she named things around the room. Clock, dresser, bathroom, wall, doorknob, rug, lamp, Bible. She breathed deeply, the fading scent of Joseph's shampoo settling in her chest and suffocating the coiled serpent. Pillow. She breathed again and set her face against the fabric, whispering around a smile. Joseph. She pushed herself up, the drum in her ears gone and the snake dead in her belly as she swung her legs over Joseph's side of the bed and headed for the bathroom. When she was finished, she changed into synthetic pants and sweatshirt, pulling her dark hair into a messy bun as she climbed down the stairs and into the kitchen, smiling at the folded note beside the coffee maker. She started it and unfolded the paper, a grin creeping up her face as her eyes danced over Joseph's handwriting. He hasn't done this since we first started dating. What's he got planned? She smiled and finished the note, rereading it aloud, slow and careful as she leaned against the sink. Sweet Sarah, how I miss you so. Sweet Sarah, my beloved betrothed. I can't stand time apart from your sweet tender lips, nor find pleasure or work for that time I'd gladly skip. I'd run away nameless, a vagabond and stranger, but with you at my side, that time would be greater. Yet, sweet Sarah, my love, this life we must live. Still sweet as our time, together unwasted it is. Oh, sweet Sarah, I love you. She smiled with a chuckle and shook her head, setting the note aside. I love you too, dork. Sarah panted as her house came back into view, sweat sliding down her skin as her bun nearly came undone. She stopped in front of her mailbox and leaned against her wooden fence, breathing deep one final time before going through the gate and checking her time. A minute slower than yesterday. She cursed and walked up the concrete path to the front steps, fishing her keys out of the pouch in her waistband and opening the door. She made herself a glass of water and stood on her back porch, her breathing falling steady as she looked over her garden. The glass was half gone when she walked down the steps and meandered between the raised beds, running her fingers over the leaves and stems, plucking any dead foliage, checking the moisture of the soil. She stopped at the end of the beds and stared at the dirt patch beneath the shade of the trees, which was opposite the back door. Little sprigs of grass had come up here and there, speckling the ruddy gray earth with light green. It was calm. It was natural. It was still and silent and unassuming. It was a blanket over a corpse. She sighed and sipped at her water, eyes still on the grave as she wondered over the fox. What had killed it? Why had it been there at all?
Maybe it smelled the rot,
she thought,
and was already sick or dying. Maybe it wasn't hungry. Maybe it just wanted a place to die in peace.
Her cat, Maybelle, had done that last year. Crawled under the shed and laid down to die so no one would fret.
Would have been better if she died in my arms. At least then we wouldn't have had to fish her out with a rake 2 weeks later.
She turned around, trekking back for more water as her eyes drifted to the sides of the house, to the patches of infant mushroom caps breaking between the blades of grass. She furrowed her brow and sighed, mumbling that she hadn't dug deep enough as she set the glass down and plucked the fungus from the grass. It was easier than last time, only taking 15 minutes at most, but the shade was cold, and the wind made her sweat nip with the last tail of winter. She made 3 trips dumping the mushrooms into the composter, the wind picking up and tossing the trees, opening her drooping bun into loose flurries of black waves. She sighed and faced the wind, pulling her hair back to her nape, not caring of the dirt for promise of a shower, and headed back to the steps. She flitted her eyes up to the porch and frowned as the wind blasted beside her. A crow flapped and hopped under the table, something glinting in its beak.
What do you want?
It tapped its beak on the porch with a high ting, bobbing its head up and down, then side to side before tapping again. It hopped closer, meeting her at the top step and fluttering away without a squawk as she nearly stepped on it. It flapped its wings as she turned her back to it for the door, banging its beak on the porch before something twanged, high and sweet as the laughter in her dreams. She stopped, and it cawed behind her, its wing beats hollow against the wind. She turned as it squawked again, the call dwindling as their eyes met.
What do you want?
It tilted its head to the side, black eyes digging into her brown before its head fell, and it tapped its beak on something in front of it. It picked its head back up and cawed again, lightly, bobbing its head as if it wanted to wave its hands and shout, "Hello!" She walked up to it and knelt, the crow hopping back a step as she picked up the little quarter-sized brassy coin. There was a ring of text in another language around the edge of one face, a hill with the sunrise glistening at the crest amid the words. She flipped its faces and looked at the detailed rendering of a woman, her silken gown flowing around her like a goddess, an extravagant crown atop her long flowing hair, and beams of light filling the rest of the coin. She stared at her smiling face and wondered who she was. The crow squawked, bristling its feathers. Sarah lowered the coin and smiled, thanking it only half sarcastically. It nodded, drawing another chuckle from her before they parted, she going inside and the crow taking wing now that the wind had died. She set the coin in the junk bowl on the counter beside the back door, washing her hands and locking the front door before she headed upstairs.
Shower first. Then I clean this pigsty.
Tuesday, April 28th. Sarah stood amidst the lonely columns of the stone church, turning to face the gargantuan double doors behind, black grain so small and thin it almost rippled. The stained-glass window bore its dozens of eyes into her back, breathing down her nape as she twisted to find their gazes. Each and every one pale and beautiful and sharp. She padded toward the stage, silent as a cat on the warm stone, her long dark waves falling around her, gray in the sconce's sickly light. A scream cut the air. Sarah jumped and flicked between both slender archways either side of the stage. The cry came again, high and long, bleeding like a ewe screaming at its lamb was brought to slaughter. It quivered on the air, twisting in her guts until she panted, heart racing into her ears.
"Mama!"
The word burst around her, stabbing her chest like a saber, reaching inside and turning out her stomach. She dashed for the left archway, plunging into the hungry black as the sconces of the hall faded behind. She turned a corner, blinking against the sheening light of a green torch, and flying past as another high scream jabbed into her gut, twisting until it burned. Her feet pounded until her heels ached, rounding this corner and that, the smooth walls growing into a garden of bones like a petrified vine from hell. Every skull sat empty, every socket hollow, every soul long reaped, but the darkness sat full and patient and watchful.
"Mama!"
came the voice, clawing desperately, reaching with invisible hands for her. She panted, screaming,
"I'm coming, baby. Mama's coming. Mama!"
It whimpered and sobbed, hiccuping before a long, wheezing groan. A baby appeared behind her eyes, dirty and naked as tears clean trails down its cheeks. Its face contorted, a mouth open, and a blood-curdling cry like an animal was gnawing its flesh, strand by strand. It sat up and reached for her in the dark, trembling, shaking its head back and forth.
"Mama!"
She turned a corner, cutting too close and nicking her cheek on a tiny skull's jagged tooth. She covered the wound, hissing as she stopped and pulled her hand away, crimson glinting black in the ill fires of the torches. She panted, heart still pounding as she looked up, feet already turning to bolt back into the hungry darkness, and stopped at the large, yawning sockets of a child's skull. Her blood dripped from the crooked, broken tooth, landing with a cold splat as her fingers fell to her side, and more black met the stone floor. She swallowed as the darkness collected in those sockets like water. She froze as the black found her eyes and stared. She stepped forward as breath tickled the air, leaning close and out of the way of the torchlight. The sockets were still empty, its seams and cracks dark from age. The breath stirred near her face, falling from the wall and the tiny skull. She jumped back, and the jaw quivered in the mortar, shaking some free until it chattered its teeth and breathed. "Mama!" She screamed and fell back, tumbling through the darkness and slamming into her bed. She jumped up, arms and legs raised, heart pounding, eyes wide as saucers and ready to catch herself in the fall. She looked around until she remembered she was in her bedroom. The bones were replaced by green walls and locked windows. Faux hardwood and rugs replaced the stone floor. She unclenched her clawed hands from the sheets, pushing them off as she sat up and leaned against the cool headboard, letting the chill fill her lungs and rolling her head to the side until she found her sleeping husband. Joseph was no graceful sleeper. Mouth open, cheek mashed up in the pillow and blocking one eye, while the other sat half-lidded, arms bent beneath him, one leg over the sheets, the other digging into her foot. But his breath was slow, and his breath was steady. She studied his face like she'd done so many times, and slowly matched her breathing to his, setting her hand on her defined chest and tapping until her heart followed the rhythm. She smiled at him and mouthed, "Thank you," as she pulled her braid off her back and flopped it over her shoulder, rolling her head to the cloudless, nightish sea beyond the window. She watched as the stars slowly voyaged across the sapphire sky, the clamp in her chest and the knots in her stomach fading in their ancient gleam until the young light of the sun peeled back the curtain of night. She looked at the time on her phone and turned back to Joseph, smiling as he stirred against the dawn, brushing a strand of hair off his forehead. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, then sung the gentle chimes that somehow always woke him. He stirred and creaked open his eyes, furrowing his brow at her and sighing. He squeezed his eyes shut and turned his face into the pillow, breathing deeply one last time before he pushed himself up and swiped away the chimes. He fell on his side and lay still, shoulder rising and falling as he slowly drifted back into dream. She smiled and crept up behind him under the blankets, arms slipping around his waist as their legs tangled. He groaned as she kissed his nape, shaking his head and mumbling something.
What?
He lifted his mouth off the pillow and said, "Love, no. Sleep, yes." She chuckled and kissed his neck, cheek falling against his shoulder as she pulled herself close.
If you're gonna make me breakfast before you go, you have to get up.
He chuckled and, without moving, said, "Presumptuous, aren't we?"
Well, I know you can't eat, but your poor, innocent wife is starving.
She rolled on top of him, flailing herself over his back like a possessed corpse, chuckling as he protested through his growing laughter. "You're a monster," he laughed, rolling onto his back as she let her full weight lay twisted over his chest, arms and head hanging off the edge of the bed. With a monotone voice, she droned, "Feed me." He scooped her up into his arms, sitting up and turning her in his lap until they faced one another, each smiling as he kissed her nose. "You're a beautiful monster, though. You know that?" She shrugged.
You knew what you were getting when you married me, babe.
He kissed her lips, hand sliding up her back as he pulled away, eyes lingering on hers. "I wouldn't trade you for the world." He kissed her deeper, smiling as her fingers slid over his shoulder, legs wrapping around his torso. He smirked against her. "I thought you wanted breakfast?" He pulled back with a grin. She sighed and pulled herself tighter, smirking as she wrapped her arms around his nape.
This is good, too.
He shook his head, squinting up at her before pecking her neck. He traveled up with cartoonish smacks until he reached her lips and sat back, face a caricature and voice nasal. "If you love me, you will wait." She rolled her eyes.
I waited 2 years until those vows. Now I gotta wait even longer?
They smiled, and she kissed him, the character gone as he sighed. "No, but the bathroom is calling my name. Toilet first, then we make sweet, passionate love."
Hey, calm down with all that toilet talk or I won't be able to contain myself.
He cupped her face, putting on a serious mask. "Oh, but you must, my love. What would the neighbors say? And think of the children." She sat back, eyes falling as the image of the screaming baby flared behind her eyes. She put on a smile and slid away, letting him kiss her cheek before he walked into the master bath. She sighed as the dream resurfaced, eyes piercing through the world. Bones flew past her. Her cheek burned, her ears rung with screams. The child's skull breathed. "Mama." "How many times have you had the dream?" Joseph asked from behind as they descended the stairs.
Well, it's not the same each time, but maybe 2 or 3.
She chewed her lip as they rounded the landing, stopping to face Joseph.
It's just weird. I mean, we haven't even talked about kids, and it's not like I'm pregnant or anyone's thought I'm pregnant. If my subconscious is trying to tell me something, I wish it would just spell it out.
We haven't talked about kids, but maybe you subconsciously want one.
I haven't even thought about kids, though. Have you?
She leaned her shoulder on the banister, furrowing her brow at him. Honestly, yeah. Not all the time, but I think about what we'd do, if we're ready. You know, the normal stuff. She nodded, eyes drifting and flitting back before memory could take her. "Maybe," he continued, "you're worried about it and don't even realize. You could be compartmentalizing or something, or pushing it down, and this is just how it's resurfacing." She nodded, eyes distant as the talking skull glinted over Jason's face. She sighed, rubbing her eyes and turning to go into the kitchen, swallowing bile.
I'm not terrified of having kids, though. We both want them, it's just a matter of when.
Could it have something to do with your mom?
Why would it?
Her stomach growled and churned. Well, you're not your mother, but maybe you're worried you'll treat your kids like she did your brother? He squeezed her hand as they walked past the fridge, which I don't think you'll do, by the way.
I know.
She sighed, sitting in the stool beside the island, her stomach growling again.
I just don't know what to make of these things. I don't have dreams like this. Even when I had nightmares as a kid.
I know, babe, but I don't know what to tell you. Maybe just meditate on it? They don't come every night, right? She shook her head, finding his eyes as he turned with a pack of bacon and a handful of eggs. Her stomach leapt into her mouth, and she shook her head.
No, maybe 1 a week? Please, don't make that.
He furrowed his brow and looked her up and down, setting them back in the fridge and feeling her forehead. Are you all right? She smirked.
I'm not sick just because I don't want the normal.
No, babe, you just went pale and clammy.
What?
Her stomach growled again.
I'm probably just hungry. Low blood sugar or something.
Well, what would you like then? 5 minutes and multiple leaps of the stomach later, the only thing that didn't crawl into Sarah's nose like the smell of death was a bowl of fruit and plain yogurt. Joseph sat on the bar beside her, kissing her temple as he went to the coffee maker and brought her a full mug. She nibbled at the fruit, testing the flavor, the texture, and her stomach didn't flip. She ate, sipping at her coffee as Joseph pulled the blinds open on the window above the sink, unlocking the back door to peek out as the dew became steam on the grass. He pulled it shut. I'll need a flannel when I head out.
What's your appointment?
Sarah asked around her fruit. 10. Don't worry, there's still plenty of time for me to dote on my beautiful wife, bedhead and all. She scrunched up her face, chuckling as he leaned against the counter and watched her.
What?
He shook his head with a smile, turning and knocking into the junk bowl beside the back door. He caught it before it spun onto the floor, chuckling at himself as he put it away and picked out something, toying it between his fingers. Where'd you get this again? He held the coin up to his face, the morning light glinting off it like a second sunrise.
The blackbird, remember?
She swallowed her coffee and her stomach tightened. She cleared her throat, mouth watering as Joseph nodded. We should look it up, see if it belongs to anyone. Her stomach twisted, throat closing on a hard swallow as she set her bowl down and breathed deep, food climbing up her chest, eyes stuck on the floor as her mouth filled with spit. If not, we should see if it's valuable. Her breakfast punched up into her throat. She bolted for the hall beside the stairs as Joseph finished his thought. A little extra money wouldn't go unappreciated. Babe? She burst into the bathroom, vomit in her mouth as she fell to her knees and heaved into the toilet. Joseph landed at her side, one hand on her back, the other pulling her hair out of her face. She retched twice and came back to sit on her heels, wiping her mouth with her arm as she found Joseph's eyes. Something sat under his skin that didn't come often.
Worry? Concern?
Whatever it was better than pity. She nodded and cupped his face.
Better. Sorry.
For what? Like you wanted to vomit? She smiled and rolled her eyes as he kissed her temple. You want some water? She nodded.
I'll stay here just a second in case.
He nodded and brought a glass, standing with his hands on his hips as she rinsed her mouth and sat back against the wall. A long, quiet sigh fell from her lips, untying the knots in her gut. You good? Joseph asked, leaning on the wall opposite. She nodded with a smile, holding her hand out for him. He pulled her up and rubbed her back, filing them into the kitchen. She looked at the remnants of her breakfast and sniffed at it, tasting and waiting. She shrugged her shoulders when nothing happened and headed through the back door with Joseph to sit at the table. Still hungry? He asked with a smirk.
Well, seeing as my stomach's empty now, yes, still very much hungry, you jerk.
They both smiled and sat back, enjoying the smell of the morning, the fireside light of the waking sun, the promises of their garden. Joseph played with the coin in his hands, sitting forward to scan it. Can you make out what it says on the back? She shook her head, setting down the empty bowl.
I looked it over when the bird gave it to me. It looks like Latin, but I haven't used that in forever.
He rose, coin in palm, as he collected her bowl. I'm going to do a little research before I head to the dock.
Babe?
Sarah said, eyes still on the garden and drifting over the fox's grave, nearly covered in a green blanket.
Do you think we're ready? For kids?
He paused, frowning in thought, eyes flitting like busy bees over the garden. I don't know. Dad told me you're never really ready for kids. You just do what's right and leave 'em be. He found her eyes again and smiled, a deep turn on the lips that glittered in his eyes, leaving her with the ghost of a hand on the cheek and a kiss to the forehead. She smiled back with a little nod, turning back to the garden.
I'm gonna stay out here for a little bit. It's too beautiful to leave alone.
He nodded and went inside, shutting the door and rinsing the dish before disappearing into the house. Sarah sat alone, coffee in hand and steaming in the light as her dream whispered behind her ears. The baby's cry echoed down the shadows of skeletal halls. The skull blossomed behind her eyes, dripping with her blood and crumbling mortar. "Mama," it whispered. She frowned and sipped her coffee, hand falling to her stomach and rubbing absently as her eyes sat in the void behind the world.
What are you trying to tell me?
She whispered to herself, to the air, to God. Mama. After finishing her coffee, Sarah wandered past the front door to the living room and plopped down next to Joseph, him cross-legged, laptop open, and face distractedly thoughtful.
What's your finding, Doctor?
She asked, pulling her legs against her chest and leaning on his shoulder. He flicked between her and the computer, blinking like he'd just noticed her, and pecked her forehead. A bit, actually. He scrolled up to an image of the coin's twin set in a silver circlet, the queen shining and smiling. He pointed to it. Apparently, this thing's part of a set. Don't remember how many, but it's part of Grimshaw's history, going all the way back to just after the church was finished. She sat back and looked at him, grinning as he set the laptop aside to turn to her, hands waving like he wanted to talk over his mouth, face beaming. So, a while back, the hill the church sits on was the local suicide spot. I couldn't find why people were doing it that often, but whatever. Anyway, the church bought the land and built the cathedral to keep people from using it. That's what the creepy statue behind the church is dedicated to, by the way. She scrunched up her nose at the memory of the dedication. A stone woman beneath a tree mourning over her husband's corpse, dagger still in hand and forearm opened wide. Yeah, he continued. Well, it brought a lot of work for Grimshaw, so people were happier, I guess. But after the church was complete, and I mean like right after, there was a huge plague. No one really knows what it was, because it came and went in just a few months, but it killed a lot of people. So, you know the story of the demon monks? She nodded. That's where this came from.
Wait, I thought that was just a local legend.
No, he laughed. A group of clergy actually became Satan worshippers and sold their souls or whatever to get rid of the plague because God didn't answer their prayers or something. They made these coins as part of a pendant and wore them to mark their order. The weird thing is, the illness was gone after that. Things weren't normal, though. I just started reading something about kids, but I haven't gotten that much further.
Wait, so demonic priests made that thing?
He nodded with a smirk.
And now it's in our house. I'm chucking it.
No, wait, it's gold. She looked at him like an exhausted mother. I mean, it's probably pure gold. The priests made this thing back then. Everything's opulence with them, right? Not to mention, this is part of history. Our town's history, and even occult history. If we can find a buyer, who knows what they'd be willing to pay? Sarah sighed and sat back, staring at the ceiling as the shining woman on the coin flashed behind her eyes, thinking,
if it's satanic, why the woman? How much we talking?
She added aloud. I don't know, but a private buyer could offer us a couple grand if he really was into it. She kept staring at the ceiling, kneading her lip before she flicked to the clock above the archway to the living room. We could always use the extra cash, he continued. Besides, it was literally dropped in our laps. Why shouldn't we take advantage a little? She slapped his knee and shot up, blinking against the stars and head rush.
Fine, but get rid of it quick. I don't want that cursed thing here any longer than it has to be. Now get up and get dressed or you'll be late.
He looked at the clock and jumped up with a curse, thanking her before bolting up the stairs. She followed him, changing as he brushed his teeth and hair and switching places in the bathroom after he'd finished. He pulled on his t-shirt and chuckled in the doorway. You know, I bet that's what's wrong with your mom. She looked at him and raised her eyebrows, smirking as she brushed her teeth and mumbled an answer. I mean, she was christened in a church with demonic priests. Of course she's so nasty. She spat and chuckled.
Well, she isn't Christian, so there goes that. She must just be crazy.
She rinsed her brush, ignoring the memories at the back of her mind begging for her attention. Her teenaged half-brother screaming at their mother screaming back that she hated him, slapping him, their mother shrieking half-naked in her front yard drunk at 9 a.m.
Yeah. She's just crazy, babe. Trust me.
She gave a quick laugh to lighten the mood, but she wouldn't find his eyes. Couldn't let him see that.
Just drop it,
she thought.
She's the last thing I want to think about right now.
She breathed deeply, knowing he didn't mean harm. See, that's the thing. She's not a Christian because she's obviously possessed by a demon. It's the only logical answer. She chuckled and put on a smirk, walking past him with a pat to the shoulder.
Obviously.
Then they headed downstairs. Each grabbed their keys and phones, the coin catching the sun by the door as Sarah left the kitchen for the foyer. They walked out to the drive and kissed.
Text me if you think of anything else we need from the store.
Will do, babe. Be safe. She kissed him again and they parted. He started his truck, backing onto the empty road and rumbling away as she sat back in the driver's seat and set the keys to the ignition, running over the list in her head and pulling forward.
Toilet paper, paper plates, chicken thighs, some vegetable. Maybe I'll make green beans. We haven't had that in a while.
She followed their street to the light at the main road, looking in her purse and checking for her emergency tampon.
Might as well get another box to be ahead of the game.
She furrowed her brow, staring into her purse before sitting back and watching the red light and traffic.
What's today?
She checked her phone and swallowed.
I'm late. Should have been last week.
Her dreams swelled in the back of her mind as the light changed. Shrieking babies and skeletal hulls darkened behind her eyes as she pulled forward. Her hairs stood on end as she looked up with her mind's eye and found the stained-glass window, the woman and man and all their children staring with pale, knowing eyes. She laughed nervously, bringing loose hair behind an ear.
Come on, Sarah, get it together. You've been late before. It'll probably hit you today or tomorrow.
She clenched her jaw against the screaming memories of her mother, middle-aged in her bathrobe, picking up suitcases and throwing them onto the front lawn as her half-brother pulled in from work. She'd stood there, hands on her hips, cigarette bobbing between her lips as she cursed him and screamed for him to get his things and leave.
You're not my son!
She'd cried.
You never were! And you made damn sure to let me know every chance you got!
Her shrill voice echoed as her brother turned around one last time to tell Sarah goodbye. Their mother had stopped him and shoved him into his car as Sarah screamed for him, running for his door as their mother pried her away. His face hardened as she stared at the memory until it finally changed. A skull. The simple, smooth skull in the catacombs whispering for her from behind her brother's car window, where it shouldn't have been, where it never was. She gripped the wheel and whispered,
You're just late.
She hovered over the bathroom sink, waiting for the pages of her life to unfold, waiting for the waters to clear so that she could glean her destiny, waiting for them to appear. One line or two. The twin pregnancy tests sat on the counter, simple white plastic on simple white porcelain, but their simplicity hid their power. One line would cast her into one life, two cast her into another, her and Joseph, and another. She chewed her lip, unblinking eyes fixed on the screens, fingers gripping the counter until her knuckles popped, blood hissing in her ears.
Come on, come on, come on!
She flitted between them and stopped as each line bled through. The die was cast. Her future was written. She stared at the tests like a little girl who stumbled over her parents' half-eaten corpses, guts churning in a sea of knots, heart pounding against her ribs, roaring in her ears. She backed away and shook her head, breathing deep as the baby's screams echoed. The child sitting in filth, screaming for her, cheeks cleaned with tears. The pale man holding her baby, the half-formed skull in the catacombs breathing for her. "Mama." She turned around, hands on her hips, slowly breathing, telling herself, "Smell the roses, blow out the candle. This can't be happening," she thought. "This isn't mine." She looked down at her stomach and set a trembling hand over her navel. The knot settled. The bird in her chest stopped thrashing its cage. The roar in her ears was gone. She grinned nervously, thumbs stroking over her tank top before she blurted out a laugh, and her eyes watered. "I sound like Mom." She lifted her head and blinked the tears away, setting her jaw and nodding. "But I'm not." "But how are we going to afford this? I mean, this changes everything. Everything. Should we keep it?" She didn't hear the thought until it had sprouted, and her heart twinged. "Of course we're keeping it." She looked down at her stomach. "Of course we're keeping you. My baby." She chuckled at how absurd it sounded, her skin rising in goosebumps as a chill washed her skin. She smiled wider and tried the words again. "My baby." Her smile faltered. Her hairs stood on end, skin crawling as warmth settled up her back. The air was too close, like someone was behind her, but there was nothing. She was alone. She was facing the door. It would be stupid to think someone was with her. Then warmth washed out from her spine, and the snakes in her gut coiled. Cold sweat beaded on her nape like electricity as her breath came sharp and hard. Nothing was there, and the nothing was watching her, as cunning and sharp as the eyes in the stained glass window. "There's nothing there," she thought. "I'm not turning around." The air, still as it always had been, stirred on her nape, like that nothing had breathed against her, had taken her scent like a hungry dog. There was nothing there, and it was opening its mouth, unhinging its jaw to swallow her whole, swallow her baby. She looked over her shoulder, and nothing stared back, cutting the cold tension like a broken violin string. She caught her reflection in the mirror above the sink and scoffed, rolling her eyes as she turned around and leaned against the bathroom doorway, eyes falling on the tests. She watched them like they might jump away and tell the world her secret, their secret, but they didn't move. The snakes slithered apart and the cold breath fluttered away as she laid her head against the wall, pleased to lose the staring contest and shut her eyes. Her arms covered her stomach, fingers stroking the fabric of her tank top as she grinned. "Will it be a boy or a girl?" she thought. "And names! God, there's so many." Her smile fluttered down as she sank against the wall, thinking. "How many diapers will we need? What kind of food should it eat? Breast milk or formula?" Her heart danced in her chest again. What if it doesn't make it? What if I smother it? What if it gets sick? What if the cord wraps around its neck? Warmth settled on her skin, wrapping her from behind like Joseph always did, settling on her hands, squeezing her shoulders and pulling her tight against the wall. She fell into the touch and warmth as the whispers of Joseph's smell lilted around her, drawing a lazy smile on her face as she leaned her head to the side. She saw it behind closed eyes. Joseph behind her, arms around her, face settling onto her neck. His hand slid over hers to her stomach and stroked just beneath her navel. She opened her eyes and stared at the nothing, her reflection watching her smile at her own imagination. She sighed, embarrassed as though her own image could judge her, but when she found her double's gaze, her smile fell and her eyes steeled. You aren't her. You won't become her. It was low, but hard as the strike of a hammer. The door clicked and Joseph called out in a sing-song voice, "Honey, I'm home." Sarah blinked and the mood fled like a startled spirit, leaving her to stare at the twin pregnancy tests and sigh as she put them in her back pocket, meandering out to find Joseph. He flipped on the foyer light, smiling as she rounded the banister with her hands pocketed to her thumbs. His eyes were sunken and dark from fasting, but he smiled wide anyway, crossing the distance and kissing her cheek as he went to move past her. "Everything's tip-top, just a little high cholesterol." He reached the kitchen doorway as he continued. "I'm starving. You had lunch yet?"
"Joseph."
He froze and turned with a nervous smile. "What did I do?" She smiled as best she could, closing the distance and hugging him, laying the side of her face against his chest and breathing him in. He tentatively wrapped his arms around her, one finding the back of her head as he leant his mouth down to her forehead, breathing his words. "What's wrong?" She shook her head.
"Nothing's wrong."
"Well, you've got me in a vice grip, so something's up." She sighed and pulled back to look up at him. Her mouth opened, but when she found his black eyes, her tongue went limp.
"You first,"
she blurted.
"Everything's okay? I'm not married to a walking corpse, right?"
He stroked her face, brows furrowing. "I told you everything's good. You're stalling, love. Just tell me what's wrong." She nodded, the smile falling as her eyes watered, and she looked at his chest, thinking,
"Why am I acting like this? This is Joe."
She inhaled deeply and let the words slide out of her mouth.
"I have a medical report of my own. You remember how I was sick this morning?"
He nodded. "Is it a stomach bug? Wait, you don't have, cancer or anything, right?" She smiled wide and shook her head.
No one's dying."
She looked up into his eyes and took another deep breath, throat dry and guts turning over.
"Babe, I'm pregnant."
His coal black eyes morphed in front of her despite his face being stone still. Shock, confusion, disbelief, fear all swam like fire. She swallowed and stepped back, her chest tight and her stomach falling to her feet.
"Oh God, he's upset. What'll happen if he doesn't want it?"
She bit the inside of her cheek and toyed with the collar of his t-shirt, eyes flitting between his and running across his face for any sign.
"What's gonna happen if he leaves me?"
she thought. She stopped, mind focused like she'd been slapped.
"He's not gonna leave me. He loves me. Shut up." "Jojo, baby, say something."
She chuckled nervously, and they locked eyes. His hands wound up her body, rising in time with his lips and eyebrows until he gripped her shoulders, face beaming and bright. "You're pregnant? You're gonna have a baby! We're gonna be parents!" He laughed and hugged her tight, kissing her temple and rocking them together gently. "This is amazing. I'm gonna be a daddy. You're gonna be a mama!" The screaming baby flashed in the back of her mind, echoing the word in a shriek. She swallowed down the bitter chill in her chest and forced a smile, pushing them apart and nodding. "Wait," he said, eyes darting, blind to the world as his face screwed up into his thinking mask. "We need to baby-proof the house. There are sharp edges everywhere. And diapers. God, we're gonna need a ton. And food. Are you breastfeeding or are we buying formula?" His brows furrowed until his forehead was a wreck of creases and folds. "Are we in a good school area?" She laughed, her stomach setting itself back in place as her chest fluttered. She took his face in both her hands and forced their gazes together.
"Hey, we've got 9 months. Chill out, Papa Joe, or we'll both be freaking out."
He smiled wide. "A baby." She nodded, grinning wide.
"A baby."
She stood on her tiptoes to kiss him, falling down with her arms around his back, his heart thudding in her ears.
"Come on, you need to eat or you'll fall over."
He stood up straight with a smirk, leading her by her hand into the kitchen. "So do you, Mrs. Bowen. After all, you're eating for 2. She rolled her eyes with a chuckle as he sat her down in the bar stool, putting on a mock serious face. "Now you just stay right there. I don't want you straining yourself in your delicate condition." She smacked his shoulder and stood back up, both grinning wide as she opened a cabinet for plates.
"Shut up. Now what do you want? I'll make you lunch if you make me lunch."
Deal. He wrapped around her from behind and kissed her neck, his warmth spreading over her, pulling her lips into a smile. A baby. He set his hands beneath her navel and absently stroked his fingers, goosebumps spreading as his scent surrounded her. His skin, his shampoo, his aftershave. Him. She smiled wide and turned her head to the side, eyes drifting from the back door to the glinting golden coin in the junk bowl beside. Her smile wavered as the shining woman looked at her with sharp, knowing eyes. The stained glass window bloomed in the back of her mind. The pale man held her baby. The whispering skull chattered. Mama, mama, mama. She swallowed around a dry throat. A baby.